Welcome back to my podcast. This is episode 4. I'm a battered wife, and this is my story. To give you context, dear listener, I have been telling you about my background. Last week, I told you the story of my mom and dad. Today, I will talk about our life with them. Here, I wish to say that some of what I will tell you is speculation based on what I have heard from various sources, including my parents. As I had mentioned earlier, Ajay, dad, was not too happy to be married off so young simply because the lady in question, mom, had refused to marry his older brother. But those were the days of unquestioning obedience towards parents. In fact, more accurately, things were decided for you, and whether or not you felt like obeying, it was considered a done deal. But of course, some sparks of assertiveness did crop up from time to time, like my mom refusing to marry Seb, the person who was not very educated and kind of had crude mannerisms and was 10 years older than her. And so Guddu married Ajay, who was just a few months older than her. As I mentioned in the previous episode, mom's sister was to marry dad's brother, Ranjit, the school teacher. So the elders decided that both the couples would get married on the same day at the same time in the same mandap. That would save money also. Here's mom's strange superstition that comes into play. For some reason, mom believed that if two couples got married at the same time, at the same place, they would not have sons. And that was a horrible prospect for a Punjabi. Weirdly, this did come true. Both sisters gave birth to girls and had no boys. Dad's way of registering his protest about what happened was to simply not acknowledge mom as his wife initially. Mom continued to live at her parents' place, whilst her older sister, who had married Ranjit, the school teacher, went to her in law's place and started living with them. The villagers whispered that poor Guddu would be an abandoned wife and that her husband probably would never come to fetch her. These talks also made my mom nervous because she did realize that her husband did not seem to accept her as his wife. Nonetheless, she continued her life at her parents' house as usual, looking after her nieces and nephews, looking after her cow and her hen, and handling all the household chores single handedly now that her sister was at the in law's place. During summers, mom would wake up at 4 and rush around completing all her chores before the heat became unbearable. 5 years passed like that. Then, one day, Ajay did visit Guddu's place to fetch her. Finally, Guddu's prayers had been answered. But alas, there was a huge culture shock in store for Guddu when she went to her in-laws' place. Though Ajay's family did own lots of land, their house was a kacha house, a mud house. Before the wedding, the bichola or the marriage broker had praised Ajay's family to the skies, saying they were very gentle and spiritual people. One of the things he had said was that the family woke up at 4 a.m. every morning and chanted their prayers. They were very spiritual people. So her first morning at her in-laws' house, mom woke up at 4 a.m., completed her ablutions, had her bath and everything, waiting to join the family in the morning prayers. Nobody budged for the next couple of hours. There were other shocks in store. At her parents' place, Guddu and her siblings had always been spoken to gently. They had refined mannerisms, and people in the household conducted themselves with dignity and restraint. With the kind of respect that Guddu's dad commanded in the village, he ensured that his kids never heard crude or harsh words, nor came across anything that he considered inappropriate. Mom tells us how, at that time during the village functions or weddings, people arranged for loudspeakers and played the popular records of the time. So, records are turntable records, and later we've seen like cassettes and CDs and DVDs. So, initially there were these record players. But since Guddu's dad considered the popular songs crude and inappropriate, no one in his village dared to play any loudspeaker during celebrations as long as he was around. Now, at her in law's place, Guddu observed the opposite. The women of the household got no respect and were talked down to. The men often used derogatory terms to refer to the women in this household, including paid, which translates to sheep but is meant in a derogatory manner. And this was true also of the school teacher. He was educated, but then that's how they behaved with women. Having lived in a non farming household, mom was not used to the hardships of farm life. But she rose to the challenge. In the previous episode, I mentioned mom's first pregnancy. At the time, dad was serving with the Indian Armed Forces. As per the rules at the time, he could not be married, let alone have a baby. So he had convinced mom to secretly abort the baby. This incident considerably compromised mom's health. Until that time, she had been a strong, healthy young woman. It took Grandma, Guddu's mother, several months to nurse her back to health after that abortion, which almost cost Guddu her life. After Dad's 5 years of service were complete, he had an option to continue with the armed forces or to leave. He chose to leave, I'm guessing because he did not want to study for months to appear for the requalification exam that was necessary if he were to continue. Besides, he had other plans. Dad had an offer from the central government to lead a special project as chief engineer. The project was called the Rural Rehabilitation Project. Taking up this project meant spending a few years in the thick jungles of Madhya Pradesh, a state in India. Dad accepted this offer, and with mom in tow, they set forth for Madhya Pradesh. The purpose of this project was to raze several parts of the lush jungles in central India in order to accommodate the Hindu refugees who were fleeing from Bangladesh at the time. Till date, I do not understand why these refugees could not be accommodated in West Bengal. After all, that would be a place more suited to them. Nevertheless, Dad and his team were a mini community who set up camp literally in the midst of the jungles. The entire team lived in tents. They arrived in the jungles and cleared space to lay out their tents. Dad's tent was the biggest and most lavish one. It had rooms, I think. Mom and Dad had a servant boy available to them all day. And thus, the relatively new bride started life with her husband after the initial misadventures. The couple settled into a routine. But of course, Dad came from a household where the men had never learned how to treat women with respect. Even though Dad was academically gifted and was more educated than all his siblings, except Ranjit, the school teacher, who was married to mom's older sister, and Dad had experienced life in the big cities, he probably operated from the same primitive paradigm as the rest of his family when it came to his wife. I feel that deep inside, Dad always resented mom a little and also believed that it was normal for a man to treat his wife poorly. I may be wrong, of course, but that is my assumption based on what I have heard and witnessed. Or maybe he's too independent a spirit and does not really like to consult anyone or confer with anyone when it comes to taking decisions. Dad does take decisions as though he were the only one impacted or involved. He seems to constantly forget that his decisions and actions impact his family members. I've heard little snippets of how he treated mom in the initial days. I feel the early days set the tone for the relationship. When one spouse, oftentimes the woman, is making her best efforts to make the relationship successful and the other spouse is callous, the latter spouse loses a valuable chance to have an ally for life. Once a spouse is disillusioned and loses respect for the other, the relationship usually functions from that angle. Unfortunately, the clueless partner neither realizes what potential the relationship held, nor does he realize the loss that the relationship has suffered now that the other spouse has lost respect for him. One incident that mom had narrated with reference to how her attitude and reverence and respect for dad changed gradually was concerning the portable radio. Living in the thick jungles, there was absolutely nothing in the name of recreation or entertainment. Mom would finish her household chores and just sit waiting for dad to come back home. Now, dad had a portable radio. One day, mom says that she was preparing a meal and had the radio in her lap. She was listening to the music and cooking. I'm guessing that dad saw the radio as his possession solely. I think he heard it playing and it probably made him angry that his wife dared to use it. The kitchen was positioned in such a way that the person who was cooking had her back to the entryway. So mom had not even realized that dad was home in that tent. All of a sudden, the radio was yanked away from her and dad walked away with it. Mom was stunned at this rude behavior. In addition to this, mom started noticing other shortcomings in dad, such as a lack of discipline or the inability to stick to schedules. For instance, when dad told her he wanted to study for his graduation exams, mom would wake up at 4 a.m., prepare tea for dad, and then wake him up so that he could study. But he wouldn't wake up, he would have the tea and go back to sleep maybe. When a spouse behaves like a male chauvinist and doesn't even have the substance to back up his arrogance, it is a recipe for relationship disaster. While I see my dad's misdemeanors as mild transgressions that were followed by reformation, I witnessed a much darker and menacing version of this behavior later when I grew up and got married. If dad's transgressions were to be seen as a level 1 on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd see my husband's behavior as 10 squared or cubed. It was as if you took everything that was wrong with my dad or men in general, all the wrong things that they could do, and then multiplied it 100 times, and then stripped away any intelligence or talent or anything that was good. That was my husband. And yet, I lived with him for almost 2 decades. But more about that later. I will see you next time with another episode. Till then, stay healthy, stay well. Bye for now.